Dr. Thompson is the BB&T Research Professor in the Department of Political Science at Clemson University and the Executive Director of the Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism. He received his PhD at Brown University, and he has also been a visiting scholar at Princeton and Harvard Universities and at the University of London. Dr. Thompson has written and edited 5 books, including the award-winning John Adams and the Spirit of Liberty, Neoconservatism, An Obituary for an Idea, The Revolutionary Writings of John Adams, Anti-Slavery Political Writings, 1833 to 1860, and Freedom and School Choice in American Education. In recent years, Dr. Thompson has also published essays on a range of topics such as children's rights, natural law theory, Marxism, progressive education, and free market education. He is currently completing a book tentatively titled The Ideological Origins of American Constitutionalism. And tonight, Dr. Thompson's topic is capitalism moral? Brad, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much, Professor DeRosa. It's great to be here at Florida Atlantic University. We've gotten off to a little bit of a late start, and I've got a lot of material to cover, so what that means is I'm going to probably just pick up the pace a little bit, if you don't mind, which means you need to buckle up. It's going to be a bit of a bumpy ride. I'm going to go fast, and I'm going to go hard, but I do want to get through this material. And the other thing is, I've got a sort of formal talk prepared, but I'm also doing it in conjunction with this, something called a Prezi, which I'm using for the first time in my life. So I don't know how it's going to turn out. We'll see. Prezi's kind of like a PowerPoint thing, but it's different. So bear with me if I don't quite get it right. All right, let's go. So the animating theme of my talk today asks this question: is capitalism moral? Now, the answer is obviously contested, and it hinges on, I think, a more fundamental issue, namely the question of selfishness or self-interest. So here's my thesis. Any moral defense of capitalism must be able to defend the idea of self-interest, or it must fail. And this is because there is, in my view, an undeniable connection between self-interest and capitalism. Morally speaking, economic freedom means the freedom to be self-interested. The fact of the matter is that business activity is a selfish activity, and the free enterprise system encourages and rewards such behavior. Every day in America, tens of millions of men and women are engaged in productive, profit-seeking work that is motivated by their selfish love of their work, their selfish love of their families, and their selfish love of their own happiness. But here's the problem. We've all been taught to believe that selfishness means greed, right? And we all know that greed is bad, right? Now, capitalism's most vociferous critics, that is, the Marxists, Nazis, and Southern slaveholders, have always known this fact. At the deepest philosophical level, they have all denounced capitalism for the same reason, because it liberates and rewards self-interest and its economic corollaries, the profit motive, competition, and money-making. Now, I don't get to say this very often, but on one fundamental point, I am a Marxist. And I don't even mean a Groucho Marxist. I mean the real deal, a Karl Marxist. Marx, I think, got one thing exactly right. He correctly identified the moral foundation of capitalism. In his essay on the Jewish question, Marx saw the necessary connection between capitalism and self-interest. He wrote, quote, "The practical application of man's right of liberty is man's right to private property. The right of man to private property is therefore the right to enjoy one's property and to dispose of it at one's discretion. without regard to other men, independently of society, the right of self-interest. Close quote. Now, I think Marx was right. Capitalism is grounded on self-interest, which means that it stands or falls depending on whether self-interest can be defended morally. Marx and all of his 20th and 21st century descendants view capitalism as immoral precisely because it is grounded on selfishness, and everyone knows that selfishness is bad. Even capitalism's supposed defenders argue that capitalism is anathema to any kind of decent moral idealism. If socialists are repulsed by the idea of self-interest, conservatives, by contrast, are embarrassed by it. Consider the views of Irving Kristol, the so-called godfather of neoconservatism. Kristol wrote, quote, "Who on earth wants to live in a society in which all, or even a majority of one's fellow citizens are fully engaged in the hot pursuit of money, the single-minded pursuit of material self-interest?" To put it in another way, who wants to live in a society in which selfishness and self-seeking are celebrated as primary virtues? Such a society is unfit for human habitation. Thus saith the Old Testament, the New Testament, the Quran, the medieval theologians, all of modern moral philosophy. Close quote. Under Kristol's terms, who could be for selfishness and self-interest? The short answer is no one, which is why American conservatives have failed to defend capitalism. It's not possible to defend capitalism if you are ashamed of its undeniable moral foundation. This is why when libertarians and conservatives talk about capitalism, they do so almost entirely in economic terms. Capitalism is good, they say, because it delivers the goods, because it's the most productive and efficient economic system ever devised by man. The problem, of course, with this view is that even Karl Marx knew it was true, and he said so repeatedly. His 20th and 21st century descendants, today's liberal socialists, typically do not like to talk about economics, and with good reason. Instead, they prefer to talk about capitalism in moral terms. They argue that capitalism is unjust and immoral. Unjust because it creates inequalities of wealth, and immoral because it's based on selfishness, which means greed. In this epic battle of ideas, capitalism's defenders have captured and held the moral high ground, while its critics, the Marxists and Marx's descendants, have captured and held the moral high ground. The problem, of course, is that in any battle between morality and economics, morality will always win over the long term, which is precisely why this country has been on the road to serfdom for the last 85 years. Now, my goal tonight is to defend the indefensible. That is, to offer some reflections on what the Frenchman Alexis de Tocqueville described in his classic book, Democracy in America, as self-interest rightly understood. The radicalness of my thesis, I think, can be summed up in this proposition: that self-interest rightly understood is, and I repeat, is a moral ideal worth defending. Now, before I turn to my defense of self-interest rightly understood, let us put the issue of selfishness in a broader context, in a broader historical context. The question of self-interest has been the central moral problem of Western religious and moral thinkers for 2 millennia. Classical political philosophy, Christianity, and modern socialism, both in its international and national varieties, have all denounced selfishness as immoral. And they have all upheld self-sacrifice as the moral ideal. To better understand the problem of selfishness, let's pause for a moment and examine two famous parables drawn from two of the great texts in the Western philosophic tradition. The first from Plato's Republic, and the second from Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments. The thought experiments of Plato and Smith, I think, sum up all of the misconceptions that surround the concept of self-interest. Start with Plato. In Book 2 of the Republic, Plato, speaking through Socrates, takes up the claim that, quote, the life of the unjust man is far better than the life of the just man, close quote, and that doing injustice is naturally good. Doing injustice, to repeat, is naturally good. Now, to illustrate the philosophic issue at stake, Socrates' interlocutor, Glaucon, poses a thought experiment for Socrates. Glaucon invokes the myth of the ring of Gyges, a ring that gives its holder the power to become invisible and to commit crimes, whatever crimes one wants. Now, the moral question raised by Glaucon is this. Is it, and I'm sort of putting it now in our contemporary terms, is it in your self-interest to lie, cheat, and steal if you think you can get away with it? For instance, if you can become invisible, would it be in your self-interest to go into a bank and steal $10 million? Now, Glaucon's assumption is yes, it would be in your self-interest, and that everyone, including the just man, would do it if they could. To think or act otherwise would be foolish. Now, the point of Plato's thought experiment is to suggest that all men are inherently selfish and therefore bad. And so you might as well get while the getting's good. We say that in South Carolina. It also assumes that the only government and social convention can force men to appear to be good. Plato's response to Glaucon is to create a government that coercively eliminates self-interest and promotes sacrifice as the highest moral ideal. Okay, now, let's fast forward to the 18th century, to Scotland, and consider Adam Smith's famous thought experiment, where he posed the following hypothetical. Imagine that, through some unstated magical mechanism, you could prevent the deaths, and I'm using this as Smith's term, you could prevent the deaths of 1 million Chinamen in an earthquake by cutting off your baby finger. Would you do it? Would you cut off your pinky in order to save 1 million people from an earthquake? Smith's answer is unequivocal. The decent man, the Christian gentleman, would sacrifice his baby finger. This is what it means to be moral. But why? Why would or should anyone sacrifice for someone else? Why must we sacrifice our own interests to the greater interests of others? Smith's ultimate point is that moral goodness is defined in some way by self-sacrifice. Unlike Plato, Smith's condemnation of selfishness does not call for the use of government force to control man's selfishness, at least not explicitly. But it does rely on guilt and a guilt-induced morality to regulate man's corrupt nature. Now, the Platonic and Smithian parables, I think, present different sides of the same moral coin. They both speak to the problem of self-interest, but each from a different perspective. Both parables take a fantastic situation and then use it to establish a universal principle. For Plato and Smith, the lesson is that men are naturally selfish and therefore need either the force of the state or public shame and guilt to be moral. Taken together, the underlying moral assumption of both is that all men would lie, cheat, and steal if they could. Or they would let a million Chinamen die in order to save their pinky, which is why a morality of self-sacrifice is both necessary and good. Now, there are, I think, several obvious problems associated with this kind of moral reasoning. First, most obviously, right, they rely on fantasy scenarios that assault the causal laws governing reality, which means that they rely on mysticism and irrationality that require men to suspend their thinking and their judgment and accept the impossible on faith. Second, they assume a malevolent view of the universe, which says that man is inherently corrupt, that he will lie, cheat, and steal whenever he can unless he is forced or shamed to do otherwise. Third, they take selflessness and sacrifice as the standard of moral value, either sacrificing others to one's self or one's self to others. In either case, the motive power is a focus on others and a negation of the self. Fourth, they are meant to induce either unearned guilt or moral paralysis or both. In either case, the inevitable result is the growth of state power in order to enforce a morality of sacrifice. In the end, the purpose of these little games is to distract you from thinking in principles and to cause you to mindlessly obey the prime directive, to sacrifice. My response to Plato and Smith is this: just as it is immoral to sacrifice others to one's self, so it is likewise immoral to sacrifice one's self to others. It's not in your self-interest to steal, even with an invisibility ring. And it's not virtuous to sacrifice a lower value for the sake of a higher value. In the morality of self-interest, rightly understood, sacrifice is out altogether. The fact is, we should not begin thinking about difficult moral issues by playing in a child's fantasy world. A proper moral theory should begin with reality, with the normal state of affairs, with the world in which we actually live, and more particularly with man. It should begin with man and the requirements for living a good life. All right, let's now fast forward from Plato and Adam Smith to the world in which we live today, to the 21st century. In our world today, we typically equate self-interest with greed, and greed is ultimately equated, of course, with lying, cheating, and stealing. The common understanding of selfishness is associated, to put it colloquially, with the idea of getting while the getting's good. Of course, from the time that we're children, we're always told to think of others first and to not be selfish. In American culture today, the doctrine of self-interest is often regarded by our parents, teachers, preachers, movies, TV shows, magazines, and newspapers as low, crass, vulgar, and sometimes evil. Not surprisingly, our cultural elite view American businessmen as morally suspect. But why? Answer: because they are, of course, motivated, it is said, by greed, the selfish pursuit of profit. This is why Hollywood movies always portray businessmen as greedy shysters and as bad guys, right? Whenever you go to a Hollywood film, who's almost always the bad guy, right? It's the CEO of some big multinational corporation, and usually has an English accent. Now let's put a sharper point on this and take a concrete example that I think should be familiar to most of you. When we think of capitalist greed, of what, or more importantly, of whom do we typically think?
Koch brothers.
Koch brothers, yeah. Gordon Gekko, Goldman Sachs.
Madoff.
Who said Madoff? The gentleman in the gray t-shirt gets the prize. Bernie Madoff will be our example. Right, Bernie Madoff. There's Bernie. Bernie stole billions of dollars from his investors in the biggest Ponzi scheme in financial history. Madoff is typically seen as the poster boy for selfishness, greed, and capitalism. But here's the question that I want to ask of all of you tonight. Was Bernie Madoff a businessman driven by the same motives as most businessmen, say a Steve Jobs or your parents, for instance? My quick answer is that Bernie Madoff was not a businessman. Certainly not a capitalist. Now let me make this point very clear. Bernie Madoff, all right, let me ask the question. Well, if Bernie Madoff was not a businessman, if he's not a capitalist, what was Bernie Madoff?
A crook.
A crook.
A smart crook.
Exactly. Well, in the end, he wasn't that smart, and I'll show you why. Bernie Madoff, in the end, was a criminal, a thief. He was not motivated by the same values as 99% of all other businessmen and women, whose primary motivation is to make a profit by creating goods and services that benefit other people. Stealing other people's wealth is what motivated Bernie Madoff. Nor was Bernie Madoff, and this is going to be the most controversial part, nor was Bernie Madoff, in my view, self-interested. Bernie Madoff, most controversially, was selfless. In fact, one might even say, with regard to Bernie Madoff's self, that there was no there. Consider the facts. Madoff destroyed his own life and those of the people he loved most. His sons turned him into the police. His wife of 50 years divorced him. His oldest son eventually committed suicide. His brother went to jail. And Madoff will spend the rest of his life behind bars. Madoff's life in the years immediately before his arrest were actually a nightmare. He lived in a state of constant fear, guilt, and self-loathing. Every single day before he was arrested, Bernie Madoff told a pack of lies to his clients, friends, and loved ones. And of course, every lie required more lies to cover his tracks. But all the lies, all the cheating, all the little deceits by which he lived his life could not and did not evaporate and go away. Instead, they built up over the years in his subconscious until the weight of his guilt crushed whatever was left of his soul. Bernie Madoff became a slave, chained to his lies. Ultimately, despite all the mansions and penthouse apartments, Rolls Royces, jets, and parties, Bernie Madoff hated his life. He hated himself. He knew he was a total fraud, which is why he was such a neurotic mess. From jail, he told Barbara Walters, quote, "I lived the last 20 years of my life in fear. Fear that he would, of course, be caught." When asked what he missed about his old life, when asked if he missed his old life, right, the lifestyle of the rich and famous, he responded, "Hell no." Ironically, Madoff says that he's actually now happier in prison than he's been in years. Why? Because lying, cheating, and stealing is a miserable way to live one's life. And Madoff hated his life. Now, does that sound like someone who actually acted in his true self-interest? I don't think so. A man who hates his life, who hates himself, who lives in constant fear and loathing, has not acted self-interestedly. He's acted stupidly, self-destructively, and immorally, which is to say he has acted selflessly. Now, let me share with you a little secret. Not only are lying, cheating, and stealing immoral, they are also impractical. Liars, cheaters, and stealers sometimes seem to get away with their dishonest schemes, but they never do so in the long run. More fundamentally, they're never happy because happiness, genuine happiness, comes from practicing and living your life according to certain virtues and achieving those, and achieving the values connected to your virtue. The selfish path to happiness demands, as I will try to show momentarily, that one live a scrupulously moral life. As we've seen now, the idea of selfishness or self-interest is possibly the most abused concept in the philosophic lexicon. Before we examine what self-interest rightly understood is, let me very quickly tell you what it is not. First, it's not about exploiting people. Ask yourself this question: is exploiting other people really in your self-interest? In your work life, are you better off lying to your employer, cheating your customers, and stealing from your co-workers? Likewise, in your personal life, are you better off lying to your friends, cheating on your spouse, and stealing from your family members? I think everyone in this room would answer, I hope, certainly, no. A society of mutually assured exploitation is in no one's rational self-interest. Second, self-interest, rightly understood, is not about hedonism and doing whatever you feel like doing. The fact that you want to do something does not necessarily make it in your self-interest. You are not, for instance, acting in your self-interest if you choose to sit on the couch all day, smoking marijuana, eating Hostess Ho-Hos and ding-dongs, and washing it all down with a gallon of bourbon, and then having indiscriminate sexual relations with the first person available to you with a pulse. Wanting something should not be confused with self-interest. Self-destructive behavior is not in your self-interest. Third, self-interest, rightly understood, is not about allowing helpless children to drown or to die helpless on the street. A common argument that one hears. In my view, not only is this a lie, it's a damn lie. The philosophy of rational selfishness says this: helping others can actually be a profoundly selfish act. We help family and friends for purely selfish reasons, because we value the role they play in our lives. We may want to help our neighbors and even our countrymen, because we share certain common values worth defending. We may even help out strangers out of a general benevolence for mankind. The selfishly magnanimous man may help the helpless precisely because he can, and because he wants to live in a joyous world without suffering. Fourth, and finally, self-interest rightly understood is not, despite what economists say, natural to man. There is nothing automatic or innate about it. There is no selfish gene. If there were a selfish gene, all men and women would automatically satisfy all their rational desires. But of course, the fact of the matter is, and we know, they don't. The fact is, man must choose to pursue his interests, and he must use his rational mind to achieve selfish values. Man is not infallible. He makes mistakes, and sometimes he acts directly in contravention of his self-interest. In fact, one might even say that most of us, a lot of the time, do not act on a daily basis in our self-interest. So what then is self-interest rightly understood? It begins with a few basic assumptions. Whoops, we already did that. The first basic assumption is that each and every individual is an end in himself, that he is meant to be self-owning, self-governing, and self-reliant by an act of choice and as a matter of principle. Second, that each and every man has a right to pursue his happiness. And third, that the pursuit of your self-interest is only possible in a free capitalist society that respects individual rights. So, to be properly selfish then means this. It means you must take your life and your happiness seriously. It means to take those steps that will help you achieve your highest goals and values. Self-interest, rightly understood, means to pursue one's values via long-range thought, principled action, and adherence to an absolute and strict moral code, to which I now turn. So, with these assumptions in place, I'd like now to dig a little deeper and make what is surely a controversial claim, as if I haven't made enough already. That self-interest, rightly understood, is a principle that should be treated as a moral ideal. And I'd like to pursue this line of inquiry further by rebooting and asking three basic questions. First, what is morality? Second, what role should morality serve or play in your life? And finally, third, why should you hold on to your moral code as a selfish possession more important than property or wealth? Take the first question. What is morality? Morality is a code of values and virtues that helps you to determine a salutary course of action as you navigate your way through a relatively long, complex, and sometimes difficult life. Morality is about choosing the ends or goals of your life, and it's about taking the appropriate actions to achieve those goals. Now, in the same way that good health is not a matter of opinion, neither is morality. Morality is a question of fact. In the same way that some things are objectively healthy or unhealthy, so some ideas and actions are objectively moral or immoral. Now, most of us, every day of our lives, right, we're selfishly concerned about our health. Typically, we watch what we eat, we exercise, and when we're sick, we go to a doctor and take medicine. In other words, we study man's physiology, we study what makes us healthy and sick, and then we take the actions necessary to stay healthy. In other words, we treat our physical health as a science, and we are properly selfish about our health. Now, morality, in my view, is a field of study that we should all take just as seriously as we do medicine and health. In fact, morality should be viewed as a science just like medicine. Both are concerned with health. Morality is concerned with the health of the soul. And each of us should be as selfishly concerned about our moral health as we should be about our physical health. A proper science of ethics will therefore discover and define the moral code most in accord with man's physical and spiritual well-being. The science of self-interest, rightly understood, is about identifying the proper ends and practicing the necessary means of human flourishing. It's about achieving happiness. Second question. What role and purpose should morality serve in your life? Let me begin with a simple fact. Everyone, every single person in this room lives his or her life according to some moral code. And the question is, which one? The second question is why? Why does everyone live according to some moral code? Unlike lower animals, man does not have an automatic code of survival. We don't have the necessary strength, speed, agility, and deadly force to compete with lions, tigers, and bears. We don't have fur to withstand the elements. We don't have wings to fly or fins to swim. And we are not equipped with the instincts used by animals to survive. In other words, man is not outfitted with a moral GPS. Every minute of every day, we are confronted with alternatives. Right? From the moment you wake up, from the moment your eyes open in the morning, until your eyes close at night, you are confronted with choices. From the moment your eyes open, maybe your first choice is to determine whether to stay in bed, hit the snooze button on your alarm clock, or get out of bed. The last decision maybe you make is, do you stay up and watch another episode of Walking Dead until 3 o'clock in the morning, or do you actually go to sleep? Now, alternatives. So we're confronted. That's part of the human condition. Every single day, we are confronted with alternatives. All of you, at this very moment, are confronted with alternatives. You can either listen to me, you can daydream, you can whisper to your neighbor, you can doodle, you can surf the internet, you can do all kinds of things, but you have alternatives. Right? The question is, what do you choose? Choice means morality. And that is an objective fact of human existence. But here's the problem. The choices we make can either benefit or hurt us. This is why I think it's critically important to make those choices based on a moral code that serves your life. But how do we make those choices if they're not automatic to us? Reason, of course, is man's unique, indeed his only means of acquiring the knowledge necessary to make the informed choices to live well. Man's ability to acquire knowledge and think logically is what distinguishes him from all other beings. Our ability to think, our ability to discover or figure out what's in our long-term self-interest is man's only real way to deal with our physical and our moral health. We therefore need a moral code that is appropriate to man's nature and one that serves his long-term interests and his well-being. That moral code must, I think, be discovered, and it must be integrated into one's life. Let me illustrate the role played by morality in your life, and I'll do it with an analogy. A moral code can be viewed as something like a compass or a map that guides you through life's deserts and valleys, or through its stormy seas. Imagine trying to walk across a foreign land without a compass or a map. Without a moral code to guide your life, you will become lost in dangerous places and subject to the whims and contingency of what Machiavelli called fortuna. The moral code you live your life by, whether you explicitly choose it or simply absorb it from the culture, will have a salutary or destructive effect on your life. Choosing the right one, choosing the right moral code is critical to your success or failure in life. And finally, to our third and last question. Why should you hold onto your moral code as a selfish possession more important than even material wealth? A man's moral character is the single most important possession he owns and controls. Your moral character defines who you are, and it defines your relationships with others. It determines whether you will be a success in life, and it determines whether you will be happy or miserable. It is the necessary foundation for achieving all of your material and spiritual values. To be morally self-interested is, however, very hard work. So in contrast to my free market economist friends, as I said earlier, I don't think self-interest or selfishness is what man naturally does. I argue just the opposite. To be rationally self-interested is actually really hard work that one has to apply one's mind to every day, all day. You must work hard to be fully moral, and you must work hard to stay moral. This is why you should treat your moral character as a selfish possession that must be protected. Once you have discovered, accepted, and actively implemented your moral code, its implementation then becomes habitual to you over time. Once your moral code is fully integrated into your consciousness, it becomes, as Aristotle said, second nature to you. It's just who you are and what you do. And so when you are in those situations in life, those sometimes tough situations where you're called upon to do the right thing, it's just automatic to you. It becomes who and what you are. Your moral character defines your identity. To be morally principled, then, is to be morally principled all of the time. It's not in your self-interest to be moral just some of the time. But as we've established already, life is full of choices and challenges. Sometimes we have incomplete or incorrect information. Sometimes we make mistakes, honest mistakes. And sometimes we just might be tempted to lie, cheat, and steal. But you can't lie, cheat, and steal just some of the time or in a vacuum. Doing it just once has a corroding effect on one's soul. The philosophy of self-interest, rightly understood, takes Spike Lee's admonition to do the right thing as one's motto. Doing the right thing means taking a principled approach to achieving your self-interest. To play on words, the principle of profit means the profit of principle. In other words, good moral character is the foundation of economic profits. Long-term success in business requires, in addition to having great ideas, acting on one's principle and in accordance with certain moral virtues. Every single year, dozens of books on how to succeed in business are published, and not a single one of those books, at least of which I'm aware, promotes the idea that it's in your self-interest to lie, cheat, and steal. This is why I say that to lie, cheat, and steal is to act selflessly. And this is why you must selfishly and jealously protect your moral character, always. One of life's difficult lessons is this: if you lose your moral character, it's very hard to get back. As the American revolutionary Thomas Paine once said, quote, "Character is much easier kept than recovered," close quote. With regard to your moral character, the bottom line, I think, is this: you made it. You earned it. It's yours, and so you must protect it and take pride in it. In other words, own it. In that great film, Rob Roy, Liam Neeson, who plays Rob Roy, captures the meaning, I think, of this sentiment when he says to his son, "Honor is a man's gift to himself." So let me bring this to a conclusion. Capitalism, I think, will stand or fall on whether it can be defended morally. It is not enough to defend economic freedom solely on economic grounds. It's not enough to say, as my free market economist friends say, that capitalism is good because it grows GDP or promotes the public interest. Instead, capitalism must be defended, I think, on moral premises, on the idea that your life belongs to you, that you have an inalienable right to produce and trade in order to make your life as successful and as happy as possible. In defending capitalism and self-interest rightly understood, I am ultimately defending the pursuit of happiness as an inalienable right and as man's highest moral ideal. I believe that self-interest rightly understood is the only proper moral code. Now, I know that claim, in fact, I'm pretty sure that much of what I've said tonight will be controversial to some of you, so I'm now happy to stop talking and to engage all of you in a conversation. Thank you. Yes, the gentleman in the cutoff.
I just want to say that I originally just came here for extra credit. Just put it somewhere I did not even expect this topic to go at all. The whole thing about morality and defense of morality and why you should be moral. Something, especially just, I've had a really bad week last week. It all started on Wednesday last week when I really tried doing the right thing one day, and it drove me down a weird path where I ended up into a real scummy situation that I couldn't even control, and I was kind of like, you know what, doing the right thing sometimes isn't always the great thing to do. And I was like, you know what, my farmer's gonna come back and help me. A few days later, a car backed into me, and my car is still in the shop. Later that night, I was presented with another devil-angel situation. Still sure it's the devil again, still sure it's the angel again. I tried to stick to my moral compass, but this week I've been questioning why. Why do I continue to follow my morals when I pass up things that I want, and I sometimes they end up getting me in scummy situations. So I'm really glad I came here today because that really answered my question as to why.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate that. And so, what I would say in response to what you've just said is, I don't know you. I don't know what your moral code is. So the first thing you need to do is to check to make sure that your moral, not all, moral codes are not all equal, right? Right? In fact, in my view, some moral codes are immoral, right? And so you need, the first and most important thing that you need to do is to check your moral premises, right? Really just sit down, take some time, and it's not going to happen in one sitting. It's not going to happen in a week. It's not going to maybe even happen in a month. But take some part of your life, just in part while you're in college, right? You're in college to be thinking about these issues. Part of what being in college about is really discovering not only who you are, but what your course in life is going to be, right? So you need to think about what that moral code is and think about whether it's actually, ultimately in the end, you have to ask this question: is it true? Is your moral code actually true? That is, that it can be validated in reality as being beneficial to one's life. That's the first thing. The second thing I would say is life is long, right? And, there have been times, I know, in my life where doing the right thing didn't seem on the surface to help advance my career, for instance. But life is long. And don't think short term, right? Always think long term. And I promise you, you will be so thankful if you can look back on your life and say, I did it the right way. I lived a good moral life. And living a moral life has its own dividends that don't always pay off immediately, but pay off later in life. And it pays off later in life relative to your relationships with other people, with your colleagues, with your family, your loved ones. But in the end, there's only one person in the whole world you have to answer to. It's not mom and dad. It's not your brothers. It won't be your wife. It won't be your children. You have to answer to yourself. You have to get right with yourself. When you do that, and over the long term, I think you'll find that living a strict moral code is beneficial to your happiness.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes?
I'm not sure I understand the example of Bernie Madoff, right? So you say that, he was miserable and unhappy, and any one of us, we don't lie or cheat or hurt the people that we care for because we feel bad about it. But I would say that those feelings come from our social conditioning and social pressure.
I'm sorry, let me just interrupt. Which feelings?
Feelings of guilt, of angst, of self-loathing, those feelings.
They can. They can come from a certain kind of social conditioning. We are complex moral beings, right? So, your moral being, as of, how old are you?
I'm 29.
You're 29. Your moral being today, you're a little older than I was hoping for. But even someone like this guy sitting right there with the green t-shirt, yeah, you, the green t-shirt, right? Well, I don't think you're 29, are you? No, you're not 29. Okay. So, his moral constitution has been largely formed from his parents, from his education, whether it's at school or whether it's at church, and even with his extended family, with his friends. But but he's now just reaching the stage where you clearly should be now at age 29, where you take what you've been given in life, namely the moral attitudes, the moral principles that you've gained from your family and the larger world in which you live. And now it's time, by now, hopefully at 29, you've sorted all that out. This guy in the green t-shirt, this is the time in your life where you now need to make sense of who you are, what you are, where you've come from, and where you want to go. And where you want to go may not be directly connected to where you've come from. Right? And so to get where you want to be is the part that you add to the moral constitution of your soul that has been shaped and influenced by the broader culture in which you've lived. But you are, what I would say is that you are none of us are beholden, right, to where we've come from. We are beings of volitional consciousness. Man, we make choices. I mean, I'll just turn this inward on myself, on my own family, right? I have a brother who's a year and a half younger than I am. We grew up in the same family, same parents. They treated us just the same. We got the same moral code from them. But you couldn't find two different human beings in the whole wide world with regard to the moral choices that we have made in our lives. It's not just a function of our personalities. It's not just a function of, I like chocolate and he likes vanilla ice cream. It's not that he makes a lot of money and I don't make a lot of money. It's really, in the end, the difference between me and my brother is our moral character. And that moral character is really mostly and largely shaped not by our parents, but by the choices that each of us made in our lives. He went one way, I went the other way, even though our parents told us to go this way.
I see what you're saying, but isn't that, when you're talking about, isn't that itself a kind of moral mysticism? Right, so you're talking about, well, it's not simply your moral compass or your moral constitution, as you say. It's not simply a function of, nature versus nurture, but the choices that you make.
Yes.
So it seems as though you're appealing to some sort of ideal of free will.
Yes.
But where does that then come from? Right, it doesn't seem like you have an explanation for where that might come from. If it doesn't come from nature, it doesn't come from where you can nurture, where does it come from?
Well, okay, so that's an unbelievably hard question. Difficult question.
But that's my point.
Yeah.
It's kind of important if I'm to take what you're saying seriously. And honestly, I personally believe that you can defend self-interest.
That you can or cannot?
That you can.
Can.
The problem is that, and Heidegger said this about, the ontology of the ancients and how flawed it was, and it manifests in, Hobbes's state of nature, this kind of one-dimensional, corporal and atomistic, individualized idea of the self. Right, that when we talk about the self, we talk about the self as me, the individual, right? And, when we talk about self-interest, well, if you're going to talk about self-interest, I think the first thing that needs to be done is you need to actually talk about what do we mean by the self.
Yes. Of course,
That's
yeah.
a very vague concept.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because the self doesn't mean just me, Rachel Robinson. Part of myself and my identity also means that I'm a student.
Yeah, of course.
I'm a son, I'm a brother, I'm a former Marine, I'm an American. I mean, how else would you be able to defend or explain certain actions like a soldier jumping on a grenade?
Yeah.
Surely that's not in his self-interest. unless we realize that self-interest is not just about the individual, but that he associates himself with also his
Yeah,
unit, his
yes.
country.
Yeah. So I got it. So, I mean, this is a, you're asking me a question that I'm not gonna be able to answer, I'm not a philosopher, first, right? I'm not, yeah, so, you are a philosopher, or you are a student of philosophy? No, it's actually not, it's not a.
Don't try to put the shoe on the other foot. You're the one on the stage.
Yeah, no, I understand. But it's just a small point. In my view, there are only one or two philosophers in the entire 20th century. Everybody else is either a professor of philosophy or a student of philosophy. But that's an entirely separate question. So you're asking me to give a whole course on the nature of self. And more particularly, the question that you're asking about is the nature of free will. And that is not a question that I can take up. I mean, first, as I said, I'm not a philosopher, and that's not going to be a question that I can take up in the context of this forum.
Well, my point is just.
Because I'm wrong, hold on. Make the point, because there are a lot of other hands, and you very selfishly, a lot of other people's, no, I didn't say, no, that's not what I said. It would not be in your self-interest to completely monopolize this conversation. But it's all I'm gonna say is, that's a good and important question. And it's one that, if you get Professor DeRosa to invite me back, I'll prepare a good answer, a good lecture on that topic.
That would be great if we could actually just have like a colloquium or something.
Yeah. Okay, this gentleman. Yes, you.
Okay, I'm glad that you talked about morality. Very good presentation. My question is there like a point of reference you have that helps build morality in a sense? Because today's time we have a lot of negative projections and morality and other things. It'd be great so you have like something that helps build you up in a sense.
Yes, yeah, thank you for asking that question. So certainly, by the time you get to be an adult, and like the gentleman in the green t-shirt, I mean, you're reading all kinds of great books, you're taking courses in political philosophy, and, in my experience in life, in my experience as a professor, when I teach Plato, the best students for like a month become total Platonists. Right? And then the next month, we spend the next month reading Aristotle. And they drop the Platonism and they become Aristotelians. And then maybe we jump to the 17th century and they become Lockeans. Right? And the idea is for you now at this point in your life to be exposed to all of these ideas, and you have to be. Right? This is why it's important to take next semester the courses being offered in political philosophy, where you'll be exposed to the greatest text in the history of Western civilization, which will cause you, challenge you, force you to think about these big issues in ways that you've never thought about before, and to really confront them for the first time in your lives, and to sort them out relative to your own lives. Right? It is a mistake. It's absolutely a mistake of some professors. Right, to think that reading great books is just some abstract, theoretical game that has no connection to your life. Right? The real challenge is to be able to translate ideas into practice. Right? And that's what all of you need, I hope, are doing at this point in your life. Now, to finally get around to answering your question. So I've read all of the great texts in the history of political philosophy. And I would say that for me personally in my life, the texts that have, and the authors, the philosophers that have most affected my view of my moral and political thought, I would say would be Aristotle, and even more so in a certain sense, Cicero, the Roman Stoic, America's founding fathers, but most importantly on the most personal level, the author who has most influenced my life and the way I try to live my life day to day is the novelist philosopher Ayn Rand. So what I would recommend is that the book I would, two books I would recommend that you read. Read Ayn Rand's first novel, The Fountainhead, and then read, and the second book is more closely related to my lecture today, her novel Atlas Shrugged.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they've got a movie which is not a very good one. I'll take this gentleman.
Isn't the problem with Ayn Rand precisely this style of being thought to have an interfaction, you know, to be an acceptable capitalist? I don't have an accent, the language thing, but you will have the accents, okay? Now, in terms of morality, Ayn Rand spends a lot of time talking about positive freedoms, just as you presumably did when you created capitalism and freedom.
I'm sorry, can I interrupt, just stop for 1 second? What do you, I don't understand what you mean by positive
The freedoms to do things.
Okay.
The freedoms to do things. The freedom, for example, to get the greatest return you possibly can on your capital investment. The freedom to choose to go out and exploit other people. The freedom to...
No, stop, sorry. I will not allow that to be, I will not permit you, in the conversation of a friend, right, I will not permit you to say that freedom is the freedom to exploit, lie, cheat, and steal. Now,
I didn't say that. I said the freedom is the... Amongst positive freedoms, you may or may not subscribe to all of them. But a list of positive freedoms would include the freedoms to do things, the freedoms to get the maximum return on your capital, the freedom to choose the job you want to, the freedom to get the kind of education you want, the freedom to, it would include the freedom to exploit other people. You may not prove that. Now, my main point though being that of course there's lots of other freedoms, the freedom from exploitation, the freedom from preventable illness, the freedom from disease, the freedom from homelessness, and so on. And she's definitely silent on those things. And as in terms of the question of morality, I thought it was interesting, I think rather self-revealing, because the only reason one cuts one finger for other people is a sense of guilt. What happens to a sense of empathy? Surely one might cut off one's finger for others because of a sense of empathy. And it seems to me that you aren't to others as you would have, I mean, I'm an atheist, but it seems to me that you aren't to others as you would have them do unto you, which is a Christian ideal, isn't a bad starting point for morality. Now, if that's the starting point, here's my question as regards to capitalism. It's a wonderful theory, and we can argue about whether it's most productive. I would argue that, for example, China, that's been growing at 7 or 8%, in fact 11% until recently, has been doing well. You'll probably say, oh, well, that's because it's capitalist, and I will tell you that they have ownership of most of the things that the British Socialist government had ownership of in the 1960s, when everybody said the British Socialist government was a communist government.
Yeah.
So we could argue about the
Sure.
practice of that.
yeah.
But whether or not it's good at producing anything, it sure as hell isn't any good at distributing things. We've got $70 trillion GDP, and we've got 2 billion people of the which is $10,000 a head for 7 billion people in this country, which means the average family of four, $40,000. And yet we've actually got 2 billion people living on under $2 a day in American purchasing power, and 1 billion people living on under $1 a day in purchasing power. So whatever good it might be at producing stuff, it's certainly not in terms of my notion of morality, which is a notion of empathy and concern for others, at all efficient at actually producing morality, because we have people starving to death at the rate of hundreds of thousands every month.
Okay.
So what I'm saying is that I do not see how you can equate any defensible notion of morality with capitalism as it's currently constituted.
Well, I don't think we have capitalism. I don't think we have capitalism really just about anywhere, other than some places which come closer to it. We absolutely, in my view, don't have capitalism in the United States of America. We haven't had capitalism in this country for at least 80 years. What we have is a kind of mixed economy that is part socialist, part capitalist, and that has essentially become the model that has been adopted in most places around the world. But I mean, to go through everything you said right? And this is, I mean, I take your comments and your question as genuine and as important. But I guess I would dispute a lot of just the facts that you laid out relative to the history of capitalism. And I was also very unclear as you were presenting these facts which country or which political economic system you were referring to when you were laying these out. Because as you were describing these enormous inequalities of wealth, or as you were describing you know, the profound inequality and poverty that exists around the world, I just assumed that you were talking about socialist countries, but of course you weren't,
The
right?
greatest proportion of those 2 billion who live on between $1 a day and $2 a day, or in fact 1 billion lives on under $1 a day, 2 billion under $2 a day. The greatest proportion of those has been found in countries like India and Africa. Africa, which is of course predominantly certainly not socialist, is predominantly capitalist. India, which is predominantly capitalist. Now we may argue about the notion of capitalism, but you certainly do have something like the ability to invest. You certainly don't have in either of those countries anything like the kind of government controls that you have in a country like China, where interestingly enough, very, very few people currently are living on under $2 a day. Nobody on under $1 a day. And where, interestingly enough, over the last 20 or 30 years, they've lifted about 300 million of their 1.3 or 1.4 billion population out of poverty.
If I may interject, some of my students might be able to participate, but a lot of China's prosperity is a consequence of innovation that occurred in the West, and specifically in the United States. And even within the capitalistic model, however you want to define that, poverty has been drastically reduced globally as a result of developments that stem from what you might call the Industrial Revolution or
If I
capitalism.
may say so, we noticed the technological development when the Soviet Union between 1917, when it was a predominantly agricultural society, in 1957, became the first people in space, and they certainly didn't steal their secrets from others because they were, after all,
Oh, they did steal it, as we did from the journal.
there was no secret in space.
But, you know, I appreciate the comments, but let's get to some of the other, we have time for a couple more questions. Okay.
First, I thought it was interesting what you said on how we're taught this notion that capitalism is automatically selfishness and it is greed. I was on the phone this morning with my father. He's actually in finance, and he said, "Oh, I'm going to a speaker later on." And I said, "Well," he said, "what's the topic?" I said, "It's the morality of capitalism." And boom, right off the bat, he says, "Oh, go ask Bernie Madoff about that." So I mean, you know, it's just I think injected into us that it is. That we're just taught that capitalism is associated with selfishness, which is greed and then cheating, lying, stealing, things like that. But what I was really interested in is when you were talking about moral code and choices. And the choices that we make are the road towards our moral code. And we can take different ones that are going to take us to what ultimately makes a moral code. What I was interested in, I think, even for my own life, is how do we develop a higher or a greater moral code, and then be able to make the greater choices to ultimately go down that road and get us where we want to be.
So, I'm sorry, so the question is how do we make those,
How do we develop a greater moral code?
as individuals or culturally?
As an individual.
Yeah, as an individual. I mean, I tried to answer that question sort of in part, right? I mean, how old are you?
26.
You're 26, right? So you've developed, you've got some kind of a moral code. Now, what I find interesting is that most people, most everyone, but maybe most especially young people, if you ask a typical, college freshman or sophomore, are you moral? Right? The immediate answer, the default answer is yes, of course, I'm moral. Right? But then when you understand and realize what they do Friday night at a frat party, right, is somewhat actually different from what they actually think is their own moral code. So we, in part, as I said, we inherit part of our moral code from our families, from our cultures, from our upbringing. But as I said, now I guess twice, I mean, at some point, you need to take yourself seriously. Right? And what I find most remarkable about 19-year-olds is what inflated egos they have about who and what they are, right? What's that famous quip from Mark Twain? I always kind of botch it. It's something like, when I was 15, I thought my father was the dumbest man in the world, and when I was 21, I was surprised at how much he'd learned in 6 or 7 years, right? And in other words, I think becoming a moral person, what that means most importantly is being serious about one's self, about taking one's life seriously and realizing that what you do Friday and Saturday night at a fraternity party may not actually be in your self-interest, and it may not embody or represent the best of who and what you think you are or want to be, right? So, when I think about who and what I was, when I was 17, I promise you, I would not want my own sons to be like I was when I was 7. I just would not want them to be that. And hopefully, they are better than that. But at a certain point in my life, about the age of the guy in the green t-shirt, all of a sudden, I became very serious about who and what I was. And I changed my life. Because I realized that I was on a path, not to destruction, I don't want to be maudlin about it, but I was on the road to nowhere. Right? And the road to nowhere is not where any of us should want to be. Right? We should have serious values that we can be proud of, but of course, to achieve those values, we have to have certain virtues which are the means to achieving those values. So, just to sum up, and I'm sorry if I've said this now 2 or 3 times, I guess the lesson, the point that I'm trying to get across most importantly is you need to take yourself seriously. You need to think about who and what you are. You need to think about what your long-term values are. You need to think about the kind of moral person that you want to be, and then work hard to achieve it. The lady in the... No, I would not. No. The same moral code applies to women that applies to men, and the same moral code applies to senior citizens that applies to 17-year-olds. Now, the fact of the matter is, life is deeply complex, and in a complex life, there are, in a place like the United States, there are really sometimes even radically different cultures, and we all come out of radically different cultures, and some of those, and that includes the culture of gender. And so the question is, how do you square the very different influences that make up one's life, whether it's race, class, or gender, or half a dozen other things, right? How do you pair those things with a proper moral code? Now, the question that, embedded in your question, I think, is a really interesting subtext, which I'm not going to address, but it is, I think, something that is and should be open for serious conversation. Namely, well, let me ask you: are men and women different? this young lady says yes. You say absolutely yes, right?
I say it depends.
It depends on what?
Who you ask, what specifically you're,
Okay, well, I'm asking you.
Physiologically, they're very different.
yes.
Physiologically, they're very different, and with physiological differences, and for me, this is just, it's a question, because I don't know the answer. This is a question above my pay grade, right? But if there are do physiological differences in any way translate into psychological or differences of personality, differences of character? I'm asking this now as a question that is worth thinking about and worth having a conversation about. But go ahead.
Well, I only asked because most of your examples, other than Ayn Rand, were male and males addressing males, and mainly different in their capacity to understand or change their morality.
Yes. Well, so there's my answer to your question. Yes. Men means men and women in the context of my lecture.
And Ayn Rand's hero was a woman.
Well, Ayn Rand is my hero, and she's a woman, and in Atlas Shrugged. How many? Let me ask you this: how many of you have read Atlas Shrugged? Okay, so a few of you have read Atlas Shrugged.
I have copies in my office.
Anyone who has read Atlas Shrugged knows that some of the greatest heroes in literature are in Ayn Rand's novels. Gentlemen.
I just wanted to know, first of all, thank you for coming, I really enjoyed your speech. But why you don't reference like religion in your morality? You're talking about moral compass.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
Do you think that it's irrelevant?
No, religion is very relevant.
So I'm only asking because they both ask like questions that I
Yeah.
personally think about religion is.
Yeah, no, I didn't bring up religion, and I'll be perfectly honest with you, there was a good reason why I didn't bring up religion.
Yeah.
I'm not religious. So I'm trying to construct, I'm interested in developing a secular moral code that is absolute, permanent, universal, and eternal. Right? So Dostoevsky famously asked this question, or it's meant to be kind of a question, and that is, Dostoevsky said, without God, everything is permitted. Right? Without God, everything is permitted. And that is a view that most of my dearest and closest Christian friends think is true. And they don't get me. They don't, because they know I'm not religious, and they don't get and understand why I'm so concerned, obsessed with living a good, decent, honorable, moral life. For them, they're incompatible. I don't think they're incompatible. What I would suggest, and what Ayn Rand develops in her own philosophy much more fully than I have or ever could do, is that it is possible to establish a absolute, permanent, certain moral code that is not grounded.
That'll just like stick.
Sorry?
Like that'll just stick, and like there'll be like who's gonna be the example? Like usually there has to be like a figure. You know what I mean? For the to be like everybody. Who believes like what you're saying right now? Like a secular.
Well, I think there are lots of people. We'll take our friend from England, right? Who has identified himself already as an atheist. Yeah. And so let me ask you, do you think it is possible to be moral without religion?
I think it's only possible to be moral without religion. You see, the problem with religion is that unless you already know what morality is, then you don't know which particular religious morality to follow. in which case, if you don't know which particular religious morality to follow, then deciding which one is something you can't do. So either you've got an external standard by which you can judge between the various religions, and indeed the various subsects, the Catholics, the Protestants, the Hindus, the Muslims, or you don't. If you don't have a standard, then the one you adopt is completely arbitrary. If you do have an external standard, which you must do in order to do that, then you can have a universal principle as far as I'm concerned is empathy. Do unto others as you'd have them do unto you.
Okay.
Now, we made that clear. So it's a reflection on once you do that, that's morality taken care of.
Because we're running out of time.
Yes or no would have been.
Well, we have, for equal time, I am a religious person, so, but we can talk about that. We have time, Mr. Mueller, let's take one more question, and we're gonna have to. Listen up.
Thank you.
I don't know if it's in 11, did economic systems have to be morally justified in the first place? And how have other economic systems been morally justified?
Well, I think all economic systems have, throughout all time, been morally justified, because economic activity is a moral activity, right? All human action, right? Whether it's engaged in buying and selling, whether it's engaged in going to a sporting event. I'm personally a supporter of Arsenal Football Club, which is one of the most moral things that I do every weekend. Yeah. Yeah. Now, finally, you've said something that I consider to be fighting words. Now, so every economic system has, in one way or another, to one degree or another, had some kind of moral justification. But I would say in the last 150 years, the great titanic battle that we think of as capitalism versus communism, or capitalism versus socialism, has been, and in the end must be, not ultimately a debate about economics, but a debate about morality. And my big problem with modern American conservatives is that they have run like cowards away from a proper moral defense of capitalism. In the 20th century, essentially from the time of Marx to the present, the left in this country and in the Western world, generally speaking, has captured and held the moral high ground. And over the course of the last 50 or 60 years, conservatives and libertarians have captured and held the economic high ground. But as I think I said at the talk, in any battle between morality and economics, morality will always win. And so if you believe in a capitalist economic system, as I do, the single most important task then is not to defend capitalism economically because it delivers the goods, because it's efficient and more productive than any other system, but rather because it is moral and good. If you can't win that argument against the left, then you should stop talking and go home.
Okay, I think that's all the time we have. Thank you.